Haunted castles, major studio nightmare fuel, nocturnal box office bombs, and a monster squad that deserves so much more. An old school creepy 4-film playlist without a graveyard smash in sight. And it's all coming up right now.
Access granted.
I was working in the lab late one night when my eyes beheld an eerie sight. Halloween was upon us once again, and Halloween season in the 80s and 90s was a time for Halloween Havoc, Treehouse of Horror episodes when they were actually good, and of course Young Culture Slice suiting up as a Ghostbuster. Last October, we howled at the moon with a Teen Wolf 2 sequel Palooza special, but for 2025's creepiest time of year, we're digging even deeper and cracking open the crypt for 4 freaky flicks, some of which could have become Halloween classics, and some which, probably couldn't. Even if they had a small screen afterlife though, what all these monster mashes did have in common was that they each delivered truly terrifying numbers at the box office when they were first released. And we're starting tonight's ghoulish goings on with a 1987 movie that had all the elements it needed to grab pop culture by the nards and become the next Goonies, but instead vanish from cinemas like a vampire at sunrise. How can a film this good meet such a grim fate? Well, hop in and let's find out. Some films becoming cult classics makes perfect sense. Movies that instantly feel too niche, too out there, or too experimental to make a big splash in cinemas. The kind of films destined to find their audience in the months and years that follow, on late night TV or battered VHS tapes. But then there are films that just feel like they have everything lined up to become major hits, or maybe even blockbusters. Movies that came with the right story at the right time that seem like they could almost instantly cross over to the mainstream. From Ghostbusters to Gremlins, the 1980s was littered with films that walked this line, and 1987's The Monster Squad looked like it really could join this exclusive club. Just like Tom Selleck becoming a massive action movie star after the film Runaway, it just felt inevitable. No, just me? Anyway. But instead, the Monster Squad kind of went nowhere. So what actually happened? Let's go back to the start. The film started life with Fred Dekker, a young writer-director who took inspiration from Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein for the mash-up concept of a group of kids like the Little Rascals clashing with the classic Universal movie monsters such as Dracula and the Wolfman. While he made his first feature, Night of the Creeps, Dekker asked friend and fellow UCLA graduate Shane Black to write a full script, which ended up being very long and featured scenes that would have made the budget fairly astronomical. After Dekker cut things down somewhat, he took the script to Universal, the obvious home for the picture, but they turned it down. In the end, the comparatively upstart studio TriStar Pictures would pick it up. So rather than achieving the dream of featuring the actual Universal monsters, the makers were required to make the monster characters look just different enough to avoid copyright issues. But those monsters would at least look the absolute business, being created by Stan Winston's industry-leading studio team. The same year that the Monster Squad was released, Winston would win his first Oscar for his work on Aliens. And the work his team did on the film was right up there. Capricorn One director Peter Hyams loved the script and came on board as exec producer, helping the inexperienced duo of Dekker and Black to get the production through the studio system. On set, Hyams' style clashed at times with the inexperienced Dekker when the film went into production in the autumn of 1986, but they eventually ironed out the issues. As Dekker remembers, "It wasn't halfway through that Peter wanted me fired. It was at the end of the first week. Rob Cohen, who was also a producer on it, went to bat for me and said, 'Look, maybe he's got beginner's jitters.' Jitters or not, Dekker finished the movie. And that movie took us to an unnamed American suburb where Duncan Regehr's Dracula is not only alive but seeking the help of other classic horror monsters like the Wolfman and Frankenstein to retrieve an amulet from a small town which will lead to world domination. But a group of misfit kids discover the plot with the help of a scary German guy. Their words, not mine. And soon, while they wait for the army to get back to them, the Monster Squad are ready to fight back. Led by Andre Gower's Sean, the squad also includes Brent Chalem as the awkward outcast Horace, the older cool kid Rudy played by Ryan Lambert, and Ashley Bank as Sean's little sister Phoebe. It's a simple twist on using recognisable IP in a clever new way, and certainly more interesting than Universal's painful attempted dark universe in the 2010s, but in the 1980s the studios didn't want to know. Sadly, not many members of the public did either. The Monster Squad popped into North American cinemas on August 14th, 1987, and left not long after. The box office top 10 that week featured the likes of Stakeout and The Living Daylights, and new entries Can't Buy Me Love and No Way Out, plus even noted flop Masters of the Universe in its second week on release, but conspicuous by its absence was The Squad. Limping in at a painful number 12, far behind The Lost Boys which stole a fair amount of its thunder, it went nowhere. 1 week later, dropping to number 16, it was barely keeping its head above The Garbage Pail Kids, one of the absolute worst films ever made. It all seemed so unfair, but sometimes that's exactly what life is. Monster Squad would end up with a total of just under $3.8 million in cinemas, drastically below its $14 million budget, and before too long it crept out of theatres, and that was seemingly that. Or was it? Sorry, let me just turn that off. Or was it? Even though it unquestionably flatlined in cinemas, many years after its release, it became clear that there were fans of the Monster Squad worldwide. But it was something of a secret club. A movie that a lot of my friends who I asked whilst making this video hadn't even heard of. It retains a sizable cult following to this day, but it's also always remained an outsider rather than a constant in popular culture. It required a fan movement to get the film released on DVD in the 2000s, even if it did sell like hotcakes when that finally, thankfully happened. When I first managed to see the Monster Squad, it felt like it had come straight out of my VHS dreams. This was a bit like the Goonies, but still completely its own unique thing, with monsters, a slightly sharper edge, a couple of banging Michael Sembello songs on the soundtrack, Rock Until You Drop for Life, and endlessly quotable lines from My Name is Horace and Wolfman's Got Nards to Give Me the Amulet, you lines that should have been implanted in the vernacular forever. It's legitimately creepy, genuinely funny, and delivers an emotional shock to the system too. How had I never seen this movie before? It should have been one of the breakout hits of 1987, but instead I discovered that it had made basically no money. As much as it's clear that I'm one of those who does love this movie though, I can in hindsight kind of understand why it wasn't a bigger hit. It's a love letter to those classic Universal monster characters, but it also steered close to the bone on the horror element. And it failed to avoid getting an older classification in key markets, which stopped a fair percentage of its potential audience from even getting the chance to see it. It received a PG-13 rating in North America and a 15 certificate in the UK. Too scary for kids, not seen as cool enough by teens who wanted to watch The Lost Boys instead. It was sadly a recipe for box office failure. It's clear that the marketing department didn't really get the movie they were being asked to promote. The Monster Squad ended up a film somewhat stuck between its promotion and content, which didn't end up hurting the quality of the final product, but did mean that it struggled to find enough advocates in its cinema release to give it the opening that it deserved. Shane Black had already become a made man in Hollywood with his Lethal Weapon script, negating the negative impact of Monster Squad's perceived failure. He would go on to be one of the best writers working in the mainstream over the next few decades, and so much of what makes his work so good is present in that 1987 movie. Fred Dekker wasn't so lucky, and his promising directing career flatlined. which remains a real shame. Rather than getting to make his dream project, a Johnny Quest movie, the only other director credit he has since Monster Squad was 1993's infamous RoboCop 3. A prime sequel-palooza candidate if there ever has been one. In 2018, the excellent documentary Wolfman's Got Nards detailed the unique journey of the Monster Squad and the impact it had had on people since it was released. If you find it and have a passion for 80s cinema, I'd highly recommend checking it out. As that doc begins, Fred Dekker reflects on the film that would end up becoming his masterpiece. Is Monster Squad a cult movie? I think a cult movie is something that is appreciated in a way that people don't necessarily predict. But ultimately movies are either good or bad, and they're accepted or they're not. And for me, it's pretty simple. The Monster Squad is good, really good. It's worth 82 minutes of anyone's time. Sometimes you just have to grab life by the nards. From the sublime to the, how would you describe this one exactly? Our second movie of the night takes us deep into one Ghostbusters star's creepiest creative vision. A vision so strange that it stretched the very limits of the comedy genre. Sure, it had comedians in it, but the final film became a freaky fever dream that bamboozled pretty much everyone when it was released in cinemas in 1991. But was this weapons-grade nightmare fuel actually one of the bravest major studio experiments of the era? Or was it simply more trouble than it was worth? I've always been fascinated by those moments when stars cash in their creative chips to make a wild passion project, without any consideration for the consequences. The kind of films that get made because big names drive them forward to completion, despite almost everyone else being seemingly befuddled, confused, or horrified. Sometimes history proves them right, the movie becomes a hit, the creative gamble paid off, and everyone looks like a genius. But other times it doesn't quite go that way. At the start of the 90s, Dan Aykroyd was one of Hollywood's go-to comedy stars. After a decade that had seen him headline everything from the Blues Brothers to Trading Places and Ghostbusters to Spies Like Us, he was viewed as one of the safest pair of hands around. But the next film he chose to make would see Aykroyd become the poster boy for one of the worst received major releases of the era, perhaps of any era. And as its writer, star and eventually director, this was absolutely his creative baby, although perhaps the less said about babies for now the better. First written as a story by his brother Peter, Dan Aykroyd's script was inspired by a real-life encounter, a moment when a small-town traffic stop had ended up with him in front of a local judge, paying a $50 fine and even staying for dinner. And so began the strange journey of a film that Aykroyd wanted to call Valkenvania, a horror comedy mashup to be named after the fictional town where his bizarre film concept would be told. What if the small town folk featured were truly creepy and sinister? What if they held grudges? How far could Aykroyd take it? He combined the original concept with a bizarre cast of characters and began shopping the script around. Warner Brothers were interested, but they wanted Chevy Chase as the lead, the smug, sarcastic yuppie dragged into a small-town nightmare, whilst Aykroyd would play the crazed judge who runs the town. Filling the director's chair proved more difficult. John Hughes apparently considered it, but eventually passed. John Landis read the script and wanted nothing to do with it. To ensure that the film went into production though, Aykroyd agreed to make his first feature and direct it himself. And the film he led into production really was out there. Chase's rich financial publisher and Demi Moore's lawyer begin a road trip to Atlantic City, joined by a pair of eccentric Brazilian billionaires. They take a wrong turn and end up getting pulled over for running a stop sign by John Candy's small-town cop, before they're hauled in front of a 108-year-old Judge Valkenheiser, played with complete abandon and some crazy prosthetics by Aykroyd. The judge lives in a junkyard mansion straight out of a haunted carnival, with a wild maze of traps and contraptions, most of which seem pretty deadly. From there, the madness escalates. The quartet attempt to escape the keeper of the peace and his wild family, which includes Candy in drag as Eldona, the judge's silent granddaughter, and Aykroyd turns up again too as Bobo, one of 2 deformed grandchildren who aren't allowed inside. Oh, and the rap group Digital Underground, with a young Tupac along for the ride, are locked in the mansion too. Obviously. Truly bonkers stuff. The production was massive. This was a major movie for the studio, no doubt about it, and would end up costing north of $40 million to make. When the studio saw Aykroyd's finished film, they requested considerable cuts just to reach a PG-13 certificate. It was meant to be Warner's Christmas 1990 release, amazingly enough, but when they realised it wasn't quite the vibe they were going for, they pushed it back to early 1991. And they changed the title from Valkenvania to Nothing But Trouble, a decision Aykroyd publicly revealed that he disagreed with. When it finally did arrive on February 15, 1991, Nothing But Trouble was, perhaps not unexpectedly, met with scathing reviews. Roger Ebert despised it, called it a truly amazingly bad comedy, one for which he had nothing but sympathy for all the actors and even more sympathy for the audience. TV Guide called it one of the worst attempts at comedy ever filmed, and Entertainment Weekly noted that most of the jokes are so lame that Chevy Chase can't even bother to look nonchalant. A sadder excuse for a movie would be hard to imagine. As the Washington Post review put it, it's nothing but trouble and agony and pain and suffering and obnoxious, toxically unfunny, bad taste. It's nothing but miserable. And audiences seem to agree. It could only make it to number 8 in its opening week, trailing behind the likes of Silence of the Lambs, Sleeping with the Enemy, Home Alone, Dances with Wolves, and LA Story. So a pretty solid list of competitors, but it also made less than half the first week haul of the John Candy comedy King Ralph, and was well behind our old sequel-palooza friend, The Never-Ending Story 2, an inglorious beginning for a big-budget, star-laden picture. Nothing But Trouble made just under $8.5 million domestically, nowhere near the reportedly almost $45 million production budget. The brutal reaction clearly impacted performance, but the change in title and oddly ill-fitting marketing did the movie no favours too. It was presented as more of a run-of-the-mill comedy when it clearly was nothing of the sort.
Chevy Chase, Dan Aykroyd, John Candy, and Demi Moore are in Nothing But Trouble.
Boris Vallejo, the artist behind numerous beautiful film posters of the era, including Chase's vacation movies, was commissioned to create a really stunning illustration to promote the film, but the more commonly seen poster was as generic as they come. Releasing it as Valkenvania and playing up the horror-tinged concept more could well have introduced it to a different audience, because the crowd expecting another Spies Like Us were most certainly in for a shock. Maybe horror fans could have dug it if they understood what it actually was all about. Whatever they did end up with clearly didn't work for the people of 1991 though. But through the lens of a film to watch at Halloween all these years later, it kind of fits. The craft in the elaborate sets and the hugely imaginative devices and rides made the film look memorable. I'm not sure anyone could argue the quality of that work. The quality of the writing and directing though, many seem to question that. As it is, Dan Aykroyd remained a constant in pop culture, but Nothing But Trouble signified the end of his peak years of Hollywood power. He would never direct again, and transitioned into more supporting roles and a position as a legacy star. He was talented, but needed a filter rather than free rein with a big budget, and nobody was going to offer him that again in Hollywood after Nothing But Trouble. In many ways, it also represented a wider bookmark for the end of the glory days of other superstar 80s comedians. Chase's career took a considerable nosedive in the 90s from his seemingly unassailable peak, relegated to a disastrous late-night chat show within 2 years. And Candy would, Cool Runnings aside of course, largely appear in flop comedies before his sad, untimely passing in 1994. In the eyes of critics and commentators, Nothing But Trouble was an unmitigated disaster, equal parts career derailing, gross and bemusing. The almost universal sentiment seemed to boil down to what on earth was Dan Aykroyd thinking, and how did he convince so many star names and even Warner Brothers to join him? Without a director like Landis to rein him in, as star writer and creative lead, Aykroyd had unabashed freedom to deliver his precise vision. And it was quite a vision. It has to be one of the weirdest wide-release comedies ever made. The fact that he has rarely spoken about Nothing But Trouble in detail since its release makes its existence even more fascinating to me though. A maverick vision all round, gonzo filmmaking at studio level, which we don't see too much of. Maybe for good reason, who knows. Comedians don't tend to get the power to make huge creative swings for the fences like this in Hollywood these days, and I'd argue that's a shame. It's definitely not a cozy viewing experience, but the fact that it is actually a bit disgusting feels like it's kind of the point. There is clearly some social commentary going on here, whether that is about the way rich snobs view people outside of their upper class bubble, or a metaphor for the way capitalism has fostered the decline of smaller communities and towns. The fact that Aykroyd risked his top-level career to tell this story is brave, or crazy, or both, and the fact that the studio agreed to finance and release it is also slightly insane. It could be genius, perhaps it's just madness, or maybe it's a combination of the two. It's not a film I am gagging to watch again instantly, but I'm glad I watched it again overall. I might crack it out next Halloween, if I feel up to it. A film so strange, it can't really be forgotten, even if many of those involved might wish that it could be. Performance art masquerading as a major 1991 movie release. Or maybe I'm just reading way too much into things. In the dark heart of the internet lurks a monster more terrifying for YouTube channels than any vampire, ghoul or goblin. Taker of views, devourer of reach, it's the algorithm, a force that doesn't just go bump in the night. But there is hope. You can help Culture Slice fight back against the chaos. Subscribing, liking, commenting, sharing, and hitting the hype button all make a big difference. You can also make sure you have your notifications on to avoid any ghosts in the machine stopping you from seeing our latest videos. And if you're prepared to go even further, then you can now become a Club Slice channel member. So help Culture Slice and help make sure you don't get left in the dark. Next up tonight, we're sneaking into a crazy secret world from 1989 that barely anyone saw in cinemas. With studio bankruptcy, legitimately creepy visuals, and concepts far beyond the limitations of its budget, this Beetlejuice for kids ended up taking an unexpected journey to the wrong side of the tracks. But could it have achieved so much more under different circumstances? Creepy suburban stories seemed to be all over pop culture in the late 1980s. It often felt like it was Halloween all year round. After the likes of Gremlins and Ghostbusters had hit pay dirt and Thriller had become the biggest music video ever earlier in the decade, Tim Burton's Beetlejuice proved that audiences would resonate with a monster mash of horror and comedy that carried an even more subversive edge. And it came at an opportune time. The rise of VHS in the 80s, with horror one of the defining genres in video rental culture, meant that scary movies were more prominent than ever before, even the ones that didn't light up the box office. By this point though, the straight-up slasher star was a bit played out. People had been fed a constant diet of Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street sequels, and offering a fresh spin on horror cliches was a welcome relief. The same year that Beetlejuice permeated pop culture, Bill Murray took a darker comic spin on A Christmas Carol in Scrooged, which cracked over $100 million in cinemas. Also in '88, Elvira, who had made her name on TV hosting late-night horror marathons with a knowing wink, got her own movie. It didn't do much in cinemas, but it did become a perennial video favourite, and not just for teenage boys. Studios were soon scrambling to bottle that same lightning across both movies and TV. Joe Dante's The Burbs, starring Tom Hanks, arrived in '89, a satire with horror edges that is now rightly seen as something of a classic. A few months later, Tales from the Crypt launched on HBO, taking advantage of its premium cable home by getting gorier and funnier than it ever could on network TV. With this cultural backdrop, a film that took the creepy aesthetic but skewed it towards a slightly younger audience seemed to have every chance of becoming another hit from this broad mini-genre, especially one that starred Kevin from The Wonder Years. But sadly, things didn't quite work out that way when Little Monsters made it into the world. Well, two worlds actually, the one for humans and the one for monsters. Little Monsters was the debut screenplay of Terry Rossio and Ted Elliott. The premise was simple. What if monsters under the bed were real, but they were actually a vast network of pranksters who travel into our world at night to cause chaos? And what if a human boy befriended one of those monsters? So it's kind of like the story of Monsters Inc., just done more than a decade earlier and, wait a minute, it's exactly the same as Monsters Inc. We're gonna take down Disney in court so badly though. Actually, on second thoughts, moving on, the movie was made at Vestron Pictures, the film production arm of Vestron Video. The company had managed a surprise blockbuster in 1987 with Dirty Dancing, which eventually went on to make over $200 million in cinemas. The problem was, basically everything else they made was a flop, with the major studios jumping feet first into both VHS and genre films. Vestron had lost its competitive edge and had become overstretched financially. By the time Little Monsters entered production in 1988, the company was creaking at the seams. Richard Greenberg had been brought in as the director to bring the film's concept to life. Known for making title sequences and visual effects, his work on Arnold's 1987 banger Predator had earned him an Oscar nomination, but he'd never made a movie before, so it was undoubtedly a gamble. Still, with gory makeup by Robert Short, who won an Oscar in 1989 for Beetlejuice, and a sprawling monster world set built on a Delaware soundstage, the film was bound to look strikingly good for a late 80s family movie with a $5 million budget. Fred Savage starred as Brian, who discovers the existence of a monster called Maurice, played by Howie Mandel. Maurice introduces him to the world under his bed and the chaos that monsters unleash every night on our world. When Brian's younger brother, played by real-life sibling and future Boy Meets World Ben Savage, is abducted by the bosses of the monster universe, Brian must mount a rescue mission or risk becoming a little monster himself. By 1989, Fred Savage had become one of the hottest young stars in the world thanks to his role in The Wonder Years. I remember young Culture Slice being glued to that show every week, wishing I lived next door to Winnie. Anyway, with a monster-based concept that was absolutely on trend, a young household name as the lead, and the manic performance of Mandel as Maurice, Little Monsters looked at one stage like it could actually help save Vestron. Maybe. The only thing was, Vestron wouldn't really be releasing it at all. By the time the film was ready, the studio was auctioning off whatever it could and sold most of the Little Monsters cinema and video distribution rights to MGM, who had zero interest in spending money on promoting a major cinema release. It rolled out randomly on less than 200 screens in August 1989 and made under $800,000 in North America, peaking at number 25 in the box office chart. Without a major release behind it, many critics didn't even see it. Those that did generally acknowledged the sets, makeup and costumes, whilst also noting similarities with Beetlejuice, not least in Maurice. As the LA Times put it, there's sweetness and whimsicality in its fantasy, but there's also a fair amount of gross-out humour that seems designed to delight the nearly pubescent, even while it distresses their parents. Some of it is actually funny. 6 months after departing cinemas, Little Monsters would appear on VHS and later became a regular on cable TV, eventually finding an audience as it was discovered on the small screen throughout the 90s, but it would never come close to achieving what it may have been able to in cinemas. By that point, Vestron was gone. The company filed for bankruptcy in 1990, with all of its assets, including a library of 3,000 films, being sold in early 1991. Howie Mandel found the process of becoming Maurice, with the hours of makeup and layers of latex it required, so painful that he didn't make another movie for years. From his perspective, the difficulties didn't end up being worth it. The movie didn't turn out that great. I think there are people who like it, but I just didn't want to do it anymore. Writers Rossio and Elliott didn't love Little Monsters either. Neither of us much liked the finished film, a common occurrence for us. People buy the script and throw it out, and what they replace it with is obviously not as good. Obvious to everybody, of course, except the people in charge. The pair would go on to write Aladdin, The Mask of Zorro, Godzilla, Small Soldiers, Shrek, and the Pirates of the Caribbean films. So not a bad follow-up to a late 80s monster flop. Greenberg never directed again, returning to effects and title work. These days, Mandel is more famous for being a judge on America's Got Talent. As for Fred Savage, he made more movies, including part film, part Nintendo commercial The Wizard, before returning to school. He eventually shifted into a role as a TV producer and director, although more recently, his career doesn't seem to have been full of wonder years. It's clear that many of those involved don't look back on Little Monsters too fondly, especially after it couldn't even crack $1 million at the box office. But as a kid, it offered up exactly the kind of creepy, chaotic energy I wanted when I loaded a VHS tape. Rewatching it for this video as an adult, it still had its moments. It's far from perfect, but the imagination in the visuals alone was enough to make it worthwhile. I'm pretty sure that, when the time is right, my own children will find some joy in it when they're old enough. Roll on Halloween 2035. As for the suburban teen creepy horror-tinged story genre, a title that is probably only ever going to be used by me, it never went away. From movies to TV shows like Are You Afraid of the Dark and books like Goosebumps, it became its own industry through the 90s and beyond. I guess families like being freaked out, just not too much, and preferably in a big house in a nice neighborhood. Sadly for Little Monsters, circumstances meant it never got the chance to truly tap into that market, having to settle instead for slipping quietly under the bed, waiting to be discovered on video and cable TV by kids who maybe never quite slept the same way again. For our final film tonight, we're turning wildly in the direction of a 1988 haunted Irish castle comedy that looked like it might have it all, but despite a crypt's worth of familiar faces at its disposal, and coming from a director seemingly destined for Hollywood glory, this supernatural odd couple farce failed to take flight. But did studio meddling turn a potential Halloween comedy classic from treat to trick? Or was High Spirits actually just cursed from the start? Steve Guttenberg, Beverly D'Angelo, Daryl Hannah, Jennifer Tilly, Peter O'Toole, a whole host of recognizable bit part players in support, and at the helm, a hotshot director who already had an Academy Award nomination, making his debut in the Hollywood system. With a decent-sized budget and a return to the filmmaker's Irish homeland for the production, it seemed like High Spirits could really shake things up. But the film flopped and nobody seems to talk about it anymore. It's almost as if it disappeared in a puff of smoke. So how did a comedy with this much talent powering it end up haunting the VHS bargain bin rather than the box office? By the late 1980s, Neil Jordan's career was very much on the rise. He'd already been Oscar nominated for Mona Lisa, which proved he could combine genuine heart with gritty realism. The film established Bob Hoskins in Hollywood and meant that the industry was eagerly anticipating the director's next move. And that move soon became clear. He would make High Spirits to be released by US studio Columbia through their TriStar Pictures brand. A film seen as a chance for Jordan to explore Irish ghostly folklore in a mainstream comedy. It was a fascinating move. The cast soon filled out pretty impressively. Peter O'Toole, one of Britain's greatest actors, was on board. Steve Guttenberg, whose golden run in the 80s had covered hits like Police Academy, Cocoon and 3 Men and a Baby, and Beverly D'Angelo, fresh off the Vacation movies, added recognizable modern headline stars. Add in a post-splash Daryl Hannah and a young Liam Neeson as ghostly love interests, along with the likes of Jennifer Tilly and Peter Gallagher, and respected British and Irish actors Liz Smith and Ray McAnally, it was a really interesting mix, and one of the most stacked comedy casts of the decade. In November of 1987, this stellar group decamped to County Limerick to deliver on that promise. The tale they were telling centred around the failing Castle Plunkett Hotel, which an American businessman wants to move to Malibu. In a last-ditch attempt to save the place, it is given a new lease of life when it's promoted as being haunted. But when a busload of American tourists arrive, the staff attempt to give them a haunted experience, as a couple of real-life ghosts turn up too. But can love conquer all, and will they manage to survive Halloween night? It was an intriguing concept backed up by solid players in front of and behind the camera. But soon, the interference from executives began. Jordan's concept was a dark, satirical movie, closer in tone to his film The Company of Wolves than an Irish Ghostbusters, but the studio wanted something lighter, broader, and more mainstream Hollywood. Tensions ran throughout production, but they spilled over completely once it got to the edit. Test screenings of the director's first cut of the film did not go well, and executives behind the film shut him out of the process as changes were made in response. In Jordan's own words, after he was excommunicated from High Spirits, they ended up making a bland comedy out of what was meant to be a biting satire. The film would eventually appear on screens in this mangled form on November 18, 1988. Reviews were far from kind. Time Out called it a complete turkey, and the Boston Globe stated it isn't super, it isn't natural, it isn't high, and it isn't spirited. While the Washington Post simply noted writer-director Neil Jordan shows no knack for comedy. At best, it was seen as a silly sex comedy carried by the chemistry between the talent within it, but nothing more. It felt like what could have potentially been something memorable and unique had been turned into just another comedy. It didn't fare much better with audiences, landing at number 5 on opening weekend. High Spirits was overshadowed by the animation battle between Don Bluth's studio and Disney, although in saying that, it couldn't even do better than Ernest Saves Christmas, and it would only last a few more weeks in theatres. High Spirits ended up with a North American total of $8.5 million, barely more than half of its $15 million budget. And though it would be released across the world in the coming months, it would end up as little more than filler on cable TV in the years that followed. Jordan would later disown the film, never actually taking the time to watch the full finished cut of a movie that he felt, with some justification, had been snatched away from him. High Spirits would eventually be largely scrubbed from the director's Hollywood story. After another Tinseltown failure, the 1989 comedy We're No Angels starring Robert De Niro and Sean Penn, he went back to basics with The Crying Game in 1982, a low-budget British crime thriller. It would make such an impact that it earned more than $70 million worldwide on a $2 million budget, and would be nominated for numerous Academy Awards, with Jordan taking home Best Original Screenplay at the 1993 ceremony. 2 years later, he was ready to tackle Hollywood again, but this time did it with more success. Interview with the Vampire, an adaptation of Anne Rice's novel featuring a star-studded cast, made over $200 million in cinemas in November 1994. A film that couldn't have covered the supernatural in a more starkly different way to High Spirits, it finally proved Jordan could be taken seriously in Hollywood. The director would be reflective in later years on the experience of making High Spirits. The whole thing was compromised and became a monster. The studio took over the editing. It was a painful experience because as a director, you're not being allowed to finish your job. Over-ambition was to blame, the ambition of everybody to get into Hollywood. It would, however, teach him how to manage the relationship with studios and producers in his major films going forward. Though High Spirits might not have ended up as the movie Jordan wanted to make, and it would be interesting to see his cut, I definitely think it still has its charms, though it's inevitably a bit frayed round the edges given its difficult journey to the screen, The quality of the talent involved means this farce is far from a total waste of time. Messy, sure, inconsequential maybe, and many of those involved might look back on it with anger, but like at least some of the other movies we've covered tonight, High Spirits was a unique enough prospect to deserve a bit more of an afterlife following its release. One other clear common denominator between all of our quartet of frightful flicks is, they weren't released in time for Halloween? Hello?
Hello?
Hello!
Hello? Hello?
Thanks guys, that's enough. But seriously, could you not have put these films out in October? I'm not saying they would have become blockbusters, but nobody wanted to watch Nothing But Trouble in February of 1991. Or seemingly ever. In the end, none of these movies were released to time up for Halloween, and they made a combined $21 million in cinemas. Coincidence? Well, yes, probably. They also share the fact that none came close to a sequel, even Nothing But Trouble, which kind of left the door open. Maybe unsurprisingly, nobody chose to walk through it. As it is, we might have to make do with these 4 films, making a truly wild Halloween movie marathon for the ages in Culture Slice's Haunted Towers this year. Join us if you're brave enough. And after we put the creepy festivities back into the casket for another year, there's plenty more to get out of bed for coming up across the rest of 2025 and beyond from Culture Slice. As for what's next, well, it's a pretty big one. I mean, there are 7 movies to cover for our video celebrating the 2-year anniversary of the main channel. That's right, it's time for our Culture Slice approved chart show, ranking all 7 Police Academy movies. After so many of you kindly shared your rankings, our team of data experts are currently busy combining those votes with our other metrics to decide the final results. So set your goldfishes, don't fall asleep at the beach, and meet us for a pint at the Blue Oyster Bar soon. But that's not all. At Culture Slice Towers, we're also already turning our attention to Christmas. At the end of the year, it's time to party as we get our neon ski suits on and go off-piste for an exploration of a comedy subgenre that nobody seems to remember anymore. But Culture Slice remembers.
Pepperidge Farm remembers.
And you can set your phasers to slay, as we're also planning a sequel-palooza-shaped secret festive stocking filler. The channel passed 4,000 subscribers last month, which is pretty wild. All the views, subs, likes and dislikes, comments and hits of the hype button that got us there are really appreciated. Here's to 5,000. If you like what we do, you can also become a Club Slice channel member by hitting the join button below the video. Thanks so much to everyone who has joined Club Slice so far. But if you don't like what we do, yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man. And on that note, stay away from that trapdoor, remember not to say Beetlejuice 3 times, and yes, save Ferris.